Thank you so much for coming. All right, thanks everyone for coming. My name is Patrick O'Brien. I am one of the officers on the MIT Sloan Venture Capital and Private Equity Club. We're super excited to be hosting this event tonight to bring Chamath to MIT. So just a big round of applause for that, for Chamath coming. If you're interested in some of the other events we're putting on, we have other speakers coming in. Of course, not as great as Chamath. We have professional venture capital trainings. We have programming through the end of this semester, all next semester. Go ahead and scan that QR code to join the Venture Capital and Private Equity Club. So moving to introducing our speakers today. So Chamath Palihapitiya, who you all know, founder of Social Capital, host of the All In podcast, former leader at Facebook, AOL, Winamp, the Mayfield Fund. He's going to be talking today with a fireside chat with Akil Pasha, first-year MBA, works in the venture capital space, ex-AWS. So I'll leave it to them. Everyone, please welcome Chamath Palihapitiya and Akil Pasha.
Oh, here, this one.
Oh, is there another?
There you go.
Oh, you have a
Yeah. Chamath, I'm super excited to be doing this. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for inviting me. What's up, MIT?
Before we get into the hardy questions, congratulations on the 101 episodes of All In, man.
Thank you.
You guys gave us a few breakup fears on the way, but I'm glad you made it through and you committed.
You're seeing a
100.
relationship evolve in real time.
That's incredible. So as I was thinking about where we could start today, I thought it'd be fun to be kind of when you first started Social Capital. So you'd had a lot of operating experiences at Winamp, AOL, and Facebook, and then you were getting into venture when it was kind of like a closed door industry in Silicon Valley at the time, right? Like you talked about how it was hard to really get in as a venture capitalist. What were some of the operating lessons that you learned that you think translated into differentiators for you when you were getting started?
I am of this belief that the best CEOs and the best executives all have the same skill, which is that they are exceptional investors. In 2016, I did this analysis for a stock picking competition in New York called Irisone. And they asked a bunch of people to come up on Lincoln Center. You pitch in front of thousands of people, and the whole thing is done for charity, but I picked Amazon. And when I did the analysis, the craziest thing that I learned was that Jeff Bezos was literally the single best investor of our generation. And we had gone through and we had systematically picked out all the different projects that he had started, AWS, Kindle, and everything in between, as well as all the acquisitions that he had done, including Twitch and all this other stuff. And it turned out that this guy had compounded capital at more than 40% a year over 20 years. And that is unheard of. But he's a CEO. But if you go back and you read his letters, basically Bezos has a very smart principle, which is he thinks in bets, right? The 2 pizza box team thing. How do you iterate? How do you find failure modes? And how do you get to success? Another great friend of mine, but an incredible investor, is Elon Musk. How he thinks about risk and how he allocates capital. He'll get product teams in a room and it's like, I want to see iterative improvements on a weekly basis sometimes in parts of the business at SpaceX and Tesla that you would never think could be iterated on a weekly basis. And he won't allocate capital until he sees progress. So this is a long-winded way of saying my training at all of these different places was actually all the same. It's how do you think in bets? How do you make small bets? What do you actually measure? And then how do you use that to make really big bets? And the big difference is that you have to be able to be a little schizophrenic. When you're making small bets, you just need to make the bet. Don't overthink it. And when you're making big bets, 100% you have to be right. There is zero room for error. And so the kind of analysis that you do is very different. And if you train your mind in the jobs that you have to know the difference, you can be very good. So for me, that was the most important thing that I needed to bring to this job when I started Social Capital was I have a very specific way of making bets, and I wanted to make sure that this organization was able to reflect that well.
And I guess how did that, so like let's say you were looking at like an early stage startup at that point, right? You mentioned it's probably like a lower barrier of assessment you have to do. How would you kind of test for that similar like?
At the early stage, the only thing that matters is the psychology of the founders. And so I would never, it's also the same actually when I would be interviewing potential employees. I never saw a resume. I couldn't care about a business plan. It just didn't matter. The whole thing was to sit there in front of that person and really figure out what makes that person tick. Because it's the psychological attributes of resiliency that, by the way, if you go to a very good school, you'll get a lot of interview prep and a bunch of this other stuff. And the thing is, no offense to all of you, but you can trick people into being a lot more resilient than you actually are because you learn the language of resiliency. And you can memorize it, and then you'll regurgitate it to the hiring manager at Google and Amazon, and they'll hire you. And so you have to be able to see past that, and you have to take people out of their comfort zone. And so that's all I care about. If I'm hiring somebody or if I'm about to invest somebody in the early stage, like early stage I would define as like less than $10 million. But 10 years ago, it was probably less than $1 million, right? So as your assets scale, you have to change it. But the point is the same. Is this person resilient? Are they psychologically capable of getting punched in the face and figuring it out? And so you just take the bet. And then at a different part of the risk curve, it's all about this hat that this gentleman is wearing in the green. It's all about IRR. You cannot make mistakes. It is unacceptable to make a mistake. And so you got to sit there and find every single failure mode. You have to think about entry point. You have to think about the margin of safety. You have to think about all the companies that are trying to basically destroy that business or that product. And you just can't be wrong. It's crazy.
Yeah. And
it's a mind fuck. And you have to be able to flip back and forth, which is very schizophrenic if you're going to do both. If you look at all the great investors in the world, what I would aspire to be, a Druckenmiller, a Buffett, these people are blessed with this ability to, depending on the framework of risk, make a very different kind of decision with a completely different framework and have it be completely true to them. That is crazy to be that good.
yeah, and I guess, so when you're like looking at identifying all those failures, especially at startups, right? Let's say Series B and earlier, do you feel like you can almost think your way out of making good investments? Like, they talk about at
No,
that
because
stage.
I just see the person, if I like the person and I think they're resilient, and look, I've interviewed hundreds of people, so I've seen the aftermath of all of my bad decisions. Mm-hmm. And so I've had hundreds of reps of seeing my biases, the things that I fall for. And the things that I fall for have changed over time. When I was young, like at Facebook, if you look at the team that's now running that company, 3 of the top 7 or 8 executives were people that I recruited literally from day one, including the COO, the CMO, and I think maybe she's the corporate something. Anyways, so those are 3 examples of things that I got right. And there are, out of 400 hiring decisions, 310 that I got wrong. And so you just learn over time to start listening and seeing the biases that I have. I had a huge bias for well-educated people, which is I didn't like them. I would go out of my way to not hire them. I didn't like the credentials. It gave me huge, I just assumed that they were great at playing the game. That turned out to be wrong. I had a huge bias for very, very technical people. And that turned out to be wrong. So you just got to go through the reps.
Gotcha.
You know?
And I guess as you've evolved as an investor, so has sort of the areas that you would focus on, right, through social capital. It looked like early on there was a lot of big software bets, Slack, Box, Yammer, and you seem to getting increasingly more into deep tech and the life sciences. Could you talk us through how you identify those areas you want to focus on?
Okay, I'll give you the paint by numbers for how to build a multi-billion-dollar successful venture organization. Ready? Step one, you need to have a brand. The brand can come in two ways. Number one is you were born and you were running an organization in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Okay, that's not any of us, okay? But if you are of that set, this would be the Sequoias, the Kleiners of the world. You benefited from having incredible high quality deal flow and very, very, very few competitors. So the odds that you would end up funding Larry Ellison and Steve Jobs was high. And so if you go to their websites, what do they say? I funded Steve Jobs, Larry Ellison, Jeff Bezos, Sergey Brin. Well, the industry is completely different now 30 years later, okay? That's one way. The other way is that you have to build a huge brand so that the next young person is like, I'm gonna go to this person over that person. Okay, so that's step one. You have to build a brand. If you don't have one, you have to find a way of manufacturing heat. And the way that I found a way of manufacturing heat when I started Social Capital was that I focused on this one thing that I did at Facebook, which was unique, which was this growth team. And I built an entire practice around that inside of our organization. And the second, to be honest, was I was a little immature. And so I said, and was like a little crazy. But it created heat. Now, 11 years later, I would say I think I've evolved, because that's like a trick that only works when you're younger, right? People love young dilettantes. I'm sure there's a bunch of you who fashion yourself as young dilettantes. But when you're 46 and you got 5 kids, nobody cares about that. You got to be boring and reliable. But anyways, step one, build a great brand. Figure it out. Nobody's going to give it to you. So you have to be out in social media. You have to be writing blog posts. Think about this, Paul Graham. Paul Graham had to start building heat for himself at Y Combinator. How did he do it? With his essays. His essays were so incredible. And if you read those early Y Combinator essays, they're gold. David Sachs, a good friend of mine, if you listen to the pod. How is David building heat? He's providing expertise in this one very specific area that he has, and he's trying to distinguish himself. The point is, you got to find a way to create heat. How does Peter Thiel create heat? The way that his mind works is unbelievably unique. And so he finds ways to tell a story about how he thinks about the world. Mark Andreessen, how does he build heat? Andreessen has an entire organization of 50 or 60 people whose entire job is to produce tons of content to get in front of you guys to stand. Okay, so I've beaten this dead horse. Step one is you got to build brand. And then step two is I think you need to learn the art of portfolio construction. And nobody thinks about this, but I think it's very important in moments like this so you don't lose money, which is how do you make sure you insulate yourself from losses? The way that you insulate yourself from losses is not to do crazy high-priced rounds. The way that you do that is by using that heat to get in front of a bunch of people who are starting companies at the earliest stages and just rip the money in as fast as you can. Just you're buying free options. Just get as many of those bets on the table, okay? Judge the person to be hopefully resilient, get the money in. And then as things start to scale, you have to have the discipline, double down on these winners very aggressively, which means you need to get a different type of team member on the team who is, what I would say is risk averse, not risk on, whose entire upbringing makes them unbelievably afraid of ever losing money. And you get that person to be your partner to make sure that when you're pounding the money in, they're just totally freaked out. Because they'll make sure that you don't blow yourself up and you'll minimize mistakes. And if you add all those things up, you'll have a pretty decent track record and then success builds on itself. But that's the architecture of the flywheel. Any of you can do it. But the step one is the key, because if all the other steps are easy if you get step one right. How do you build heat? You got to have something interesting to say. And if you don't, you got to get around people who have interesting things to say so that you can work with them.
Would that mean like, so because that's so person-based, right? Does it almost feel like the industry areas you would focus on are less important at those early stages? Like it's really a founder bet?
Don't say that again?
So because of that focus on brand and their progress, right, over time, does that imply that you're less, say set on a particular industry to?
Yeah, because if you have heat, by the way, just on heat, one more example. How many of you guys have read Howard Marks's memos, the Good to Great memos? Unbelievable. That's heat. How many of you guys have read Warren Buffett's letters? Yeah. You know, there's only one thing I keep in my desk, which is a printed binder, two-binder of all of his letters. Unbelievable heat. How many guys have you read Paul Graham's essays? Heat. Anyways, how many of you read my letters?
Yeah.
God damn it, none of you? Lack of heat, see? I got to keep at it. How many of you watched All In? Some heat. That's good. Anyway, sorry. So if you have that, to be honest with you, you don't have to be a very good picker at that point, in my opinion. I think people romanticize this ability to see around corners. I'll tell you how I see around corners. Our brand is very strong in Silicon Valley. And the way that we measure it is we look at Twitter followers, we look at YouTube views, and we are, or I'll say me because it's at Chamath or whatever, head and shoulders ahead of the next most followed person or the next most viewed person. The next most followed person on Twitter is Andreessen, so it's me, then Andreessen. And in YouTube, it's me, then Peter Thiel. That results in 6,000 to 8,000 inbound leads a year. That's hitting us in every way, shape, or form. People DMing me on Twitter, people sending things to our inbox, people emailing our partners, other VCs who want us to do the deals. And what we do is we try to classify that. What is this person trying to work on? And what you see are trends. And we become very data-oriented and we just follow the trend. So when I started Fund One a decade ago, it was meant to invest in healthcare, education, and fintech. I had some heat. That deal flow went into two totally different places. A little bit of AI, crypto, and SaaS. And so we moved Fund Two to focus on that. And Fund Two, we did a bunch of those deals. Those did really well. But then the heat moved. It all moved into deep tech. And so by Fund Three, we're the only major investor, by the way, in space to be meaningful cap table participants in the two most prolific space companies, SpaceX and Relativity. But it's because we moved and we were there early and we were able to participate in an intelligent way to get a foothold in these things that matter. But Fund Three, it was moving again, and it was moving more towards energy transition. So we moved. Fund Four was really focused on that. Today, what I'll tell you is the equivalent people like you guys, young, smart, capable people, they're all running into only one of two areas. Number one is they're running into energy transition, and number two, they're running into life sciences. That's it. Massive multi-trillion-dollar categories that because of legislation and technology are about to get ripped apart. So just a unsolicited advice, if you're trying to figure out where to go work, those two areas will mint billionaires and billionaires and potentially a trillionaire. And so you may want to pay attention to that. There's heat.
When you look at those areas, you kind of wrote in your last letter about...
Oh, you read it?
I did.
Go on.
I read it multiple times.
Go on.
Well, you talked about how one of the traits of startups that don't work out well is when they're chasing that shiny thing of the moment, right? So like, let's say life sciences and energy storage are kind of those big things. When whether it's meeting founders or thinking about segments within those areas, how do you tease out the genuine parts that are worth backing versus the ones that are hyped?
Before I got a job at Mayfield, I interviewed at Excel. And the founder of Excel, there was two, Arthur Patterson and Jim Schwartz. They had this concept of the prepared mind. And I took that idea and I copied it. And the whole idea is you could say something like AI. It means nothing. The prepared mind would take that and literally decompose it into all of its piece parts and try to create a mosaic of what that word means. We've become very good at that. I'll tell you how I build my mosaic. So I'm now year 3 into energy transition. In year 1, there's a team at McKinsey. They are like the SEAL Team 6 of teaching mosaics. They do it for Gates, so I hired them to teach me about climate change. They charge a lot of money. It's like $3 million bucks. But you go deep, and they start at the most high-level view, and then they go all the way down to the, atom-level understanding of every single aspect of climate. That was step 1. Then step 2, Druckenmiller has this phrase, which I love, which is the best way to learn about something is to invest in it and then do the diligence. I did that. I allocated $400 or $500 million, and I said, I'm just going to rip some money into this sector, and I'm going to learn. And it forces you to pay attention. That's like, wake up in the morning money. You know what I mean? Like, you're like, okay, I got to pay attention. And so you go and you diligence, and you learn, and you see which ones you got right, which ones you got wrong, what were the biases that caused you to get the ones wrong, what were the tailwinds and accidental things that made the things go right so that you don't give yourself too much credit. And then eventually by year 3, I have a very detailed mosaic of what I'm looking for in energy transition. But it's a multi-year process to develop these things, and you can do it because it just requires a browser and some time and the willingness to just double-click into it. And that's another thing that a lot of, I think, investors could do more about. It's also a thing that entrepreneurs, I think, don't do enough of. But that mastery of an area will allow you to figure out all the things that have worked, all the things that have been tried, all the things that could work. It's just like, it's the prepared mind.
Could you take us through some of those surprises, say, in energy transition? Like maybe a little preview of things that you thought would be great but weren't? And then
well, you find these secrets hiding in plain sight. So in energy transition, you live in a state that is the most egregious. The only one worse is California in terms of how expensive utility rates are relative to how much it costs to make the power. Massachusetts and California are the most expensive. On average, your energy rates have compounded at 11% a year. That's outrageous. And so I was like, this is something interesting. And in learning about that, what I learned is that the government has subsidized the cost of solar power generation to effectively be zero. If you put a solar panel on your home, wherever your parents live, it costs them effectively nothing to make that power. It costs the utilities in Massachusetts nothing as well, between solar and wind. So you would ask, where does that 11% a year CAGRing come from? It comes from mismanagement, and it comes from very poor CapEx and OpEx. And so what I learned in this whole thing is that all of the incentives that governments are creating are about to create competition for the utilities. And you would say, well, who could compete with the utilities? It's a regulated government monopoly. It turns out that every homeowner is. And so you're about to set up 100 million homeowners to compete against 1,700 utilities. If you go and you add up all of the OpEx and CapEx that these utilities spend, it is trillions of dollars. If you think of how much debt is going to become bad debt by these utilities, it is trillions of dollars. Crazy, the amount of upheaval. So you're, what Toby Lutke says, and CEO Shopify, you are arming the rebels. And so we ended up doing this, thing to arm the rebels, to get all of these homeowners in a position to compete against these utilities without them even knowing it. Crazy. So that's the kind of stuff that you lead to these unintended consequences and these secrets hiding in plain sight that are non-obvious. But it comes because you have the prepared mind and you follow this trail of breadcrumbs.
Gotcha. Was that a similar thing that you saw when you were first getting into relativity space? I kind of love to hear the story of how you met
No.
them and then sort of went through that.
So relativity space was a very different kind of risk underwriting. So for me, the deal was a little bit on the margins too expensive. This is a company that 3D prints rockets and engines and all this stuff, and is the second most valuable space company, private space company, after SpaceX. I was very afraid that this would be an impossible kind of an idea. And so I wanted downside protection. And so I was trying to figure out, what do we do with this technology if it fails? And the conclusion that I came to was we could sell these 3D printers into the traditional manufacturing ecosystem. And it had enough value to get back our money, or 50% of our money or 60% of our money. So for me, I spent all of my time trying to make sure that there was downside protection, because those kinds of businesses, when you put a bunch of money into like hardware manufacturing, you can easily torch it. This is another thing that we do at Social Capital. We have a table. So if you ever came and work with us, you'd be allowed to make a lot of small investments until you prove that you were worthy enough to make medium-sized investments and then large investments. And we have a table, we have a table of all of our historic winners, and we have a table of all of our historic losers on one page. And we add up the dollar winners and we add up the dollar losers, and we monitor the ratio. And our ratio is about 24-1. So the most we've ever lost, when we win in the billions. We've never lost more than $27 million in a deal in 11 and a half years. And a lot of the time is because of these mechanics of the boring side of investing. Managing downside, risk management, margin of safety, boring stuff. Most people don't care about it. But if you're going to be good at the game, that's what it takes.
When you think of like broader VC, right? If you just listen to some of them talk, they're usually not as deliberate, right, about their approach to investing. Why do you think that is? And do you think that's going to change now with how everything is playing out?
So another thing that we calculate is we take all of the available data, which is all out there in the world. Have any of you guys worked at a hedge fund? Right, so you guys know what correlation is, right? And you guys know what alpha versus beta. I mean, obviously you're MIT, you're geniuses. My apologies. So do you know that you can calculate correlation in a private equity portfolio? How would you do it? You would go and look at all this publicly available data. When Social Capital invested in Slack in the Series A, XYZ firms invested beside them. XYZ firms did the B, the C, the D, the E, and you can see this correlation, right? Meaning we're all trafficking the same companies. So we look at that, and we index ourselves to 1, and then we figure out all the correlation indices for all of our competitors. And we have a running list. So, if we're a 1.0, Andreessen is 3.7 times more correlated than we are. Now, why is that interesting? It doesn't say anything good or bad about Andreessen, but it means that when we see deal flow from Andreessen, one of the filters I'm thinking about is, do I want more correlation or not? So these are all of these things that you have to do if you're going to do your job well. If you're going to be an expert at this craft and be excellent, you have to be very technical. And I think that in an up market where there was lots of beta, to answer your question, it was easy for VCs to believe their job was to buy a bunch of free options, to run around with other people's money, and to take bets. And that wasn't such a bad thing, because that was rewarded. And so it wasn't necessarily their fault. In our instance, I'm the largest investor in my funds. I take it very personally. I'm hyper competitive. I only think about returns first. Everything else is far distant second. And I hold myself to the technical excellence that will be required for me to consider myself living up to the goal that I've set for myself. And so it becomes a very lonely, very technical, very arcane job. It's not nearly as much fun as you may think, because the easy job is to give the entrepreneur money. The hard job is to sell. The hard job is to sell it in secondary. The harder job is to find a landing in M&A when the thing doesn't work. The hard job is to force somebody to do a big reduction in force because they're running out of money. The hard job is to fire somebody because they've proven themselves to be incapable of running that business. So it becomes a very, very, very tough job to do it well. We have had 4 funds over 11 and a half years. There's an organization in Boston here called Cambridge and Associates. They measure. We've been a top quartile fund every single vintage. So it's a very steady track record. We've generated 32.5% returns average over each of those funds. Our fund returns have gotten better in size. So the $1.5 billion Fund 4 has performed better than the $275 million Fund 1. We've returned 1x, almost 1x on every single one, including the 2019 vintage, which is lighting money on fire for most everybody else. I'm not saying it to brag. I'm telling you that it is a hard job. I interviewed at Sequoia once, and Mike Moritz talked me out. He psyched me out. Sat there for an hour and a half, talking, companies, trends, whatever. And he said at the end, you should not do this job. It's really, really hard.
Wow.
And I believed him. And then I just went back to my job. Because I was so scared. I was like, he's right. I can't do this. And then when I went in and I eventually did it, I understand now what he means. That's the best organization in Silicon Valley by heads and shoulders. And you can see what excellence is. If any of you play basketball, when you see the greats, how they approach the game, it is extremely technical and boring. If you talk to Steph about how he tries to do a jab step, he's timed it down to the number of milliseconds. His release has to be in a certain motion because he's got a little bit of a push motion at a certain elevated arc at the certain release angle. Does anybody want to do that? Well, it looks like artistry. It's mastery to be really good. Lonely, lonely, lonely place.
A great saying, though. It's like artistry, not mastery. I'm going to sneak one more question in, and then we'll open it up to everybody else. Something that you've done in a lot of your recent interviews is you've been very vulnerable, right, about things from battling imposter syndrome through to how, cultivating your own happiness improved you as an investor and just like a general person in the field. Could you talk us through, why you realized that was so crucial, how you went through that mindset shift, and maybe how you've seen it reflected in your day-to-day life?
Well, look, I think a lot of you guys are immigrants. A lot of you guys have immigrant parents. Other of you guys are just really insecure and had really crappy backgrounds. Some of you may have hit the jackpot like me and had both. So, look, the basics are that if I had to summarize a bunch of psychological learning, there are moments where you feel less than somebody else. And when you feel less than somebody else, you will go and try to make yourself feel better. That usually involves doing something that you will regret. And that's generally just like not your personality. Something that's loud, something that's aggressive, whatever. That is a form of self-sabotage that gets in the way. It's gotten in my way. I don't know how much more successful I would be if it wasn't for myself being the biggest retardant of my own career. And I look at my career and I think, God, there's all these things where I completely whiffed because of my ego, made me act in ways that had people or deals or situations turn away from me. And in all of those cases, it was because I felt less than and I was insecure and then I acted out. And, people will tolerate that when you're super talented in your 20s. And they'll kind of tolerate that when you're in your 30s. But by your mid-30s, nobody wants to hear that. That's like, it's over. It's boring. You're just a dilettante at that point. And so I got that message loud and clear, and I've been trying to work on it. And so I just share it because I suspect that most of you will go through it, especially as you iterate through your career, particularly if you are good at something, because you'll use it to fill that hole inside of you, but it won't really fill it. It has to come from something else. It has to come from your own self-worth. This all sounds corny, but until you realize that we're all playing this loop over and over and over again. And so it's worth fixing because that's how you get good at something.
Do you think if you were like this calm and humble back then, you would kind of have ended up in the same
I would be
place?
100 times more successful. No, if I could recount to you, because I keep a list of all the mistakes, meaning the really big high order mistakes, they were gargantuan. Gargantuan. In the way that it affected relationships with people beside me, the ability for people to support me. And then you think, well, but it still kind of worked out. Sure, in some ways, but it helps me have mental clarity on how much better I can be. And, how obsessive bettering and becoming better can become. And that's a crazy thing, right? And then when you see people that are miserable, it's people that have let some amount of success basically justify why they don't have to do that. So I don't want to be miserable. I want to be happy.
Yeah. Sounds like a smart move.
Yeah.
All right, we'll open it up then. Whoever wants to go first. And we have, yeah.
And also, this is being recorded. They know that, but when you guys come to the microphone, talk to me, they can come down to the sides.
Go ahead. I'll repeat your question if you. Oh, you want to go to the thing? Yeah. Yeah. Go.
Hey, Chamath, thanks for coming over. Huge fan. So over the years, you've strategically scaffolded your knowledge base across multiple disciplines, made calculated bets that paid off, and built a following of people who feel that they can trust you and learn from your wisdom. What would you say is the X factor trait that's contributed to not just your success, but then who you are, aside from, of course, rejecting oat milk?
I mean, first of all, oat milk is horrible. I mean, that is a toxic slurry that will never enter my person. I think it's a great benefit having a somewhat troubled background. In my case, I had very poor immigrant parents because I didn't have much to lose. And at some point, I really embraced it. And I just kind of felt like nobody will know, My kids are a little held hostage, They'll always think in the back of their mind, what will their dad think? Which is a bummer for them. I feel like that's like really unfair to them. So I think that's one thing. And then the second is I grew up as a liar because I lived in a war zone. Okay? And so in order to not get the shit kicked out of you, in order to avoid a lot of shit, you lie. Did you do that? No. Was that you? Nope, not me. Look at her, And so when I got out of that house, I massively went to the other side. And so I was super radically candid. Sometimes wasn't the right thing to do, actually. But that helped because you find that there's a lot of other people dealing with their own stuff and they appreciate it. So I think those two things really helped. Neither of them, it turns out, I could control. Very random. Sir.
Hey, Chamath. I was hoping to see one of the sweaters today, but, it works perfectly.
Bro, this is a cashmere jacket, I want you to know.
Whoo! Well, that's excellent. I wanted a question regarding the institutionalization of VC versus the historical craft nature of the business. Do you see this changing in the future? Do you see this being more institutionalized going on, or do you think it will remain pretty craft?
Yeah, no, I think that the craft nature of this business is a narrative fallacy, what Bezos calls a narrative fallacy. You want to justify your own behavior. And so that behavior, you were rewarded for being very imprecise in a very small nascent category. The reality is that technology is omnipresent and venture is going to be an asset class. It'll be no different than private equity. It'll become mature, it'll become scaled, there'll be platforms. And as that happens, you're going to have to become more systematic. And I think, there are ways. I think, I aspire to claim that we have some of those ways of running this business, which seems like artistry, in a more masterful way. And so I think the institutionalization will be good because LPs, limited partners, will become more and more sophisticated. I find half of the time what we do is we educate LPs more than we educate anybody else, because here's how we think about our firm. And when our LPs look at that data, I mean, you think they're thinking, oh, I'm just going to make this decision to invest in social capital and then never use this again? No, they're going to go to all these other tier one firms and say, can you please calculate the correlation index? Or they'll hire one of you guys, maybe, and you'll be calculating all of these things, and all of this stuff would become known knowns. So I would just encourage folks, if you're going to be in this industry, to see in advance that that's happening, and not buy into this thing that it's like, oh, I felt this thing, and I had a twinge and a pinch and a this and a that. I think that that's a lie. And I think you'll lose a lot of money in down markets if you think that's how the business works. Sir.
Hi, Chamath. I think we share a couple of common heroes in Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger. And I think earlier this year, I think Warren said he wouldn't buy Bitcoin, all of Bitcoin, for about less than $25. I'm just curious. I remember you being a little bullish on Bitcoin. What do you think is the margin of safety on Bitcoin, and are you still bullish?
I bought my first coins at $80. At one point, in the end of 2011, beginning of 2012, I had almost 5% of all Bitcoins in circulation. My average dollar cost entry point was $110. It was a massively asymmetric bet on something that was extremely technically elegant and that seemed to have a place in the world. I, at the time, only bet as much money as I was willing to lose, and then we scaled in. Over time, we sold some of that. We distributed some to our LPs. It was a phenomenal trade, and I still own some. But I own it via a company called DCG. I gave it to them. They used it to start up. I don't know if many of you have invested in the Grayscale ETF or not, but it was my Bitcoin that helped start that business, and in exchange for equity. Anyways, I believe in it. I don't have thoughts on price. I do think that it's going to replace gold for this generation. And I think in as much as that, you should think about there being a correlation. And I think Peter Thiel did the best job of this, by the way, of calculating what the correlated asset value of Bitcoin is relative to the asset value of gold in the global economy. And you can see that. I think Peter did that math. Gosh, I can't remember what speech it was. I consume a lot of this content on YouTube, but I could find it and send it to you. But he did that math. And it would tell you that, we're still early days. Sir.
Hi. So I noticed you recently made some investments in the African markets. I want to know your perspective on the potential of the African market from your point of view. Because for me, on paper, it seems that there's potential, but then if you look at the books of some of the startups, it's not too great. What's your strategy in the market, and how's your strategy for selecting pipelines in the African market?
My first investment was in 2014. It was a Ghanaian entrepreneur named Greg Roxon, and he started a pharmaceutical business. And that business now, it's like a $300 or $400 million company. So he's doing really well. It's a business that basically is building a chain of vertically integrated pharmacies and hospitals and care providers. I subsequently made a few other investments since then. My fear is that Africa is a very diffuse continent with many, many markets, with many different currencies, with lots of currency instability. And as such, the ability for somebody to build the business across Pan-Africa is going to be challenging. The people that do it, I think, can see reasonable returns, but it's going to be hard. And you're going to have to do something where you're basically have dollar pricing power. Now, Greg, in some ways, has that because he's selling drugs to the middle class. And the middle class in Africa is the same as the middle class everywhere else, which is you tend to overeat and you tend to get the same conditions of large S, which is diabetes and hypertension, and then cancer. It's morbid, but it's true. And so, Greg, I think, can build a really successful business that has pricing power in an otherwise complicated go-to-market. I think it's a lot of African companies. Ma'am?
You talk about being lonely at the top when it comes to being very technical at your job and doing the unsexy things. One, how do you still validate that you are doing the right thing, even if it's lonely? And two, how do you not get angry by kind of breaking out of that mold at the system that kind of it created? Does that make sense? Sorry.
I understood the first part, so let me see, and then you can tell me. You need to throw validation out the window. That's a vestige of outside in society trying to keep you down. You got to love it. Then you won't care about validation. You'll just be intellectually intrigued by it. The minute the validation loop starts, that's you thinking you're less than. Your friend's making more money than you. They went to work at Citadel. You didn't. You went to work someplace else. Why am I doing this? My parents are up my ass. I have all this. That's a death loop. It's a death spiral. Forget validation. If you like it, you'll be like Steph Curry figuring out how to, take 1.1 millisecond off his jab step. You got to love that. I don't know, and I can't remember the second part of the question.
The second part of the question was, by being different, how do you kind of remove that anger when it is kind of lonely in that system?
My resentment and insecurity, to be really honest with you, is omnipresent. And I talk to a therapist every Monday morning from 9 to 10. That's how I check into the workday. And I talk to a couples counselor with Nat every Friday. That's how I check out so I can be a good human being. Friday night, Saturday, and Sunday. And in between, I'm just a broiling mess. It's just a thing. I think it really sucks to have, it's both a blessing and a curse to have this kind of background, because it makes, you're always tracing in the back of your mind, like, why did this happen? Why did that happen? Why didn't this happen? Why did I do that? Why did my dad do this? Why did my mom do that? That's just me. And so it's just always there. I don't have a good answer. It's just always there. Sir,
Hey, Chamath.
Where's the hat from?
What?
Where's the hat from?
Oh, it's just a liquidity capital merge.
I was hoping for a better answer, but go ahead.
Yeah. My name is Ilya Lotov. I'm a first-year MBA student here at MIT, and I had a question for you. Like before that, you mentioned that basically venture is becoming more systematic. And if you look at history, like companies like Sequoia, basically their excess returns, their alpha was based on access and the brand name. And now people like Nick Storonsky from Revolut, they're trying to build like data-driven ventures. So do you think you can boil venture business down to numbers and AI models?
At a certain point, absolutely. The problem is that there are unique moments in a venture company's evolution that requires experienced advice that can't come from a computer, unless your exec meeting is some computer and it's like beep boop pop boop pop, and all of a sudden they know what to do. There are nuanced trade-offs, because going back to what I said before, at the end of the day, the CEO of that company is still making bets. He or she is allocating capital. And sometimes computers are not good at understanding the J-curve dynamics of certain projects. A 2-pizza box, Kindle project or AWS becomes $100 billion, trillion dollar juggernaut. I think those are very hard and require reasoning that computers are not good at doing. So it'll be an important part, no different than the public markets. There's some quant funds that do very well, but they do well in a niche. They do well in a kind of mechanic that's repeatable. typically the capital can't scale, and typically the capital can't go across strategies. And I suspect that if you have an algorithmic form of venture investing, it'll be the same way. You know, we tried this in 2015 or 16, and you know, we did a bunch of deals. Very, very hard. Very hard. Ma'am.
Hi. You mentioned that the life sciences is an area that's kind of booming in coming years. What specifically do you see becoming really big here? And so, like, for context, I've heard this likened to the like .com boom or like 90s and early 2000s of software. So I don't know if you share the same opinion.
So I said one theme, which is that the marginal cost of energy is going to zero. This other theme, which I've mentioned now a fair number of times, is that the marginal cost of compute is going to zero, because you get away from CPUs. And if you just look at, you know, you graph teraflops, largely driven by FPGAs, ASICs, and GPUs, it just keeps compounding, basically doubling every few years. What that means is that in life sciences, we've now started to tackle problems that were unbounded problems that we didn't know how to tackle. AlphaFold being a prime example. So we can now simulate protein folding to such a high degree of accuracy that computers, for very little cost, can now simulate 10 to the 33 molecules. That is the known universal space of compounds that we could use to cure disease. Now let's do the math. On average, it costs a few $1 billion to build a drug. On average, these drugs have an EV between $6 and $8 billion. If you just take that and you multiply it by the 250 to 400, you know, the head of long-tail drugs, you're talking about trillions and trillions of dollars of potential upside. And to access it is now hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars that you can raise. You know, you can put in the sweat equity or you can raise from venture investors. Basically, what I'm saying is life sciences is no longer about biologists and chemists. It's moving out of in vivo and in vitro experimentation. It is now in silico. So you should run after this problem, because it is an unbelievable convergence of mission, of purpose, and a ton of money, which is a beautiful, beautiful. I mean, why are you laughing? Fucking oat milk social justice warriors. Sir.
Hey, Chamath. I'm a first-year undergrad, and I'm interested in the VC industry. And I was wondering, what should I study over the next 4 years, and what kind of opportunities should I seek if I want to be a successful venture capitalist in the future? And also,
Bro, have you not been listening to this whole thing?
well,
I gave the whole thing.
I've got a whole notebook of notes.
Right on. Well, okay, look, I would read Wikipedia. I would spend a lot of time on YouTube. I would look at this energy transition thing in life sciences. And I would try to get a job where you can meet really interesting people that can generate the kind of heat that will help you build a brand, and partner with them.
Thank you.
Welcome. Sir.
Hey, Chamath, how you doing? I told Akil I'd ask about Laurel Piana, but I got beat to the punch on that. So you talked about being bullish on the energy transition, arming the rebels against traditional utilities, your investment in MP materials. But the reality is that we don't have the domestic critical mineral supply to kind of fulfill our clean energy aspirations. So just curious if you're confident in our ability to fill the supply gap despite kind of the environmental regulation we have here.
Yeah, I think the environmental regulations in America are going to come headstrong into the national security imperatives that we have. So these environmental regulations at the court level are not going to stand in the way. And I think that that's a really good thing, because we're going to force people to acknowledge that there's a hierarchy of needs. That for example, we don't want to be fighting resource wars. We don't want to be sending our young men and women abroad to fight for natural resources, which is what every war has been based on. And so it's happening. So I'm really bullish. The other thing that I'm bullish on is, you guys are going to an incredible school that has deep, deep, deep expertise in chemistry and material science. If you think about the periodic table of elements as a map of the United States, we really only know Washington State, Oregon, and maybe the upper part of California. And we have zero awareness of North Carolina to Florida. That's the best way that I can explain to you the fact that the periodic table of elements is very naively understood beyond just a few researchers. And so partnering with some business people, that can completely change. Maybe we don't even need lithium. Maybe there's actually a composite material that exists in the periodic table of elements that makes all this digging an afterthought. None of us knows. That's what's crazy. None of us know that that's not true. So there's an entire space of things to be explored that you can do, again, cheaply, because in silico, you can model this stuff. So I just think that the low-hanging fruit is the upper land grouse is going to get run over. The high-order bit, though, is to traverse the periodic table of elements. Sir.
Yo, okay. I'm a senior here studying CS, so 2 questions. So I know you've shown love to like Mr. Beast before and like how he's been able to branch into like traditional basic goods. 1, do you see a future in which like content creators can really make a dent in the tech space and like have unicorns being built around them? And then 2, slightly unrelated, my friend wanted me to ask, if you could lock all your money into one stock, private, public, over the next 20 years, what?
Look, I've learned that these are dangerous questions to answer because there is a large percentage of people that turn out will just literally do it. So I do not want to be responsible for that.
Yeah,
so I'm not going to answer
first question is
okay.
fine then, yeah.
It's a really, really great first question. This is another category, by the way, that a lot of you guys should be paying attention to. Let me give you the backdrop. Apple and Google are the 2 most dominant platforms in computing. They have aggregated billions of monthly active users that has translated into trillions of dollars of market cap, okay? So remember that. Billions of MAUs equals trillions of dollars of value. That was mostly I would say 2007 to maybe 2014. The rest of the 2010s, the 10s, were the app companies. Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, QQ, TikTok, you name it, WeChat. They aggregated billions of MAUs and translated it into trillions of dollars of enterprise value. Okay, you start to see a theme here. This decade is going to be dominated by individual content creators. Why? One example that sort of unleashes a good way of describing it is Mr. Beast. Jimmy, and another one, by the way, even though it's in the news for the wrong reasons, is Kanye and Adidas. It was sufficient for companies 10 years ago to make a chocolate bar. Hershey's would make a new chocolate bar. They would plug it into their distribution. It would work. Adidas would make a new pair of shoes. They would plug it into distribution. It would work. Nike would do that. Now, the people are the brand. That is the way you cut through the clutter. So now Jimmy makes his own chocolate bar, distributes it himself through Walmart. Kanye makes his own shoe and gets a distribution himself. LeBron is a brand unto himself and gets his own distribution. And on down the line. Cosmetics by Laurent, blah, 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 you name it. Spanx, or the version of Spanx by Kim Kardashian. The point is that companies are too corporate to represent brand attributes well enough to a sophisticated buyer like you guys. The content creator is the new form of social media. They are the brand ambassador, they're the message, they're the medium. And if you look, one part of this trade-off has already been paid off. They have all aggregated collectively billions of MAUs. The thing that they haven't figured out yet is how to make that worth trillions of dollars. So if you're in the creator economy, I think that is going to get paid. And the person that is the most likely to figure this out is Jimmy Donaldson, because he is going to be probably the first human being to cross 1 billion monthly active subscribers himself. He's got 370 million. Now, yeah, Ronaldo has more right now and Messi has more, but they're athletes. These guys are creating content every day. That's crazy. I think it's a ginormous shift in media consumption. To be fair, after leaving Facebook, I made zero investments in social media. And I have been really fascinated by content creator space. I cannot say more. I can't say it. No, I can't whisper to you. Ma'am.
Hi, I'm part of the EMBA program here, so I think you'd appreciate this question. So thank you for your authenticity and vulnerability in sharing who you are as a person, because I think in the end, we're all human. You know, we can put on our suits and go to work, but we
I work with two people that are not, David Freeberg and David Sachs, but yes, go ahead. Everybody but those two.
can't strip off the emotion.
Oh, they have.
I'd like to meet them. But in the end, you know, even if we're robust humans who act more robotic, we all have feelings and emotion, and that's just the DNA of who we are.
Yeah.
How have you in your career been able to manage criticism? Obviously, when you're at the top, it's not only lonely, but you're a target. And speaking of imposter syndrome and speaking of struggles with confidence, you know, what are some of the things that you have personally done in your journey to be confident despite the daggers or the arrows coming your way?
Okay. Criticism, I have always been able to take. I love it. I feed off of it. I've always sought it out. I've never been afraid of it. Hate really hurts my feelings. People you don't know that throw shade, they're dealing with their own issues. That is hate. People that know you, that take the time to sit you down and tell you that you could be better, that is criticism, that is gold. It's just that simple. So turn off comments and don't listen to the nitwits. They're dealing with their own issues. That is their own shit. That has nothing to do with you. But when your friends sit you down and say, hey, this is not cool, man, listen to that. And if you want to give a gift to your friends, do it, and you'll help them figure out how to give it back to you. I have friends that are highly critical of me. I have a partner who demands accountability, and she will not let go. And that's a gift. And then I have millions of people that follow me that throw shade from time to time. And it hurts my feelings, and so I just ignore it by turning off the comments. Honestly, it's not a sophisticated tactic.
No, I mean, I think the sophistication there is curiosity. It's prioritization, segmentation, and curiosity.
Segmentation. Your friends will get criticized. That is healthy. People that don't know you will throw shade. That is hate. That is unhealthy.
I'm curious about the criticism your friends give you, because I think that's also a skill. Right, to be curious, to have that dialogue, to be open, to be close, to have that skill, and to reflect. I don't think that's something that everyone has. I think it's things that
maybe not, but if you find the thing that you become good at, you will become obsessed with getting better, and then you'll care. You'll want to look at yourself from 360 degrees. Sir.
Chamath, thank you so much for all that you've shared.
I mean, the geniuses at MIT, you're the first one that's finally, instead of leaning into it, exactly. You're the first one that finally took it out and just.
I'm a little too tall to be doing that for too long. I'll blame it on my body structure. That being said, I wanted to say that I think it's interesting to think about this from the lens of the unorthodox types. I think that the world, and I think VC in general, has benefited from your specific perspective and what I would call being the outsider at the time. So I think about systematization of the entire VC industry and what that looks like going forward. And then I think, what would you say to someone who sees these rigid structures as being akin to kind of us getting to a place where we think we know the answer, but we don't? And so we start locking out people who have valuable things to contribute.
I think that happens a lot because I think people buy into a narrative fallacy that this is an artisan craft. And I view it a little bit more mechanistically than that. And so when we build our organization, it's all over the place. On every metric possible. Like if you look at gender distribution, racial distribution, age distribution, educational distribution, Republican versus Democrat, everything is in just this soup. And the reason that we set about to do that is because we're trying to mechanistically get to the right answer. And so the more mechanistic that you are, the more optimized you will be for diversity, because it's a feature of getting all these inputs in. And so I think as things become more systematic, there will be more of these people that have more of a say, that don't map to traditional norms. Like, for example, I don't know where any of my partners went to school. I mean, I know one. I know Carmen went to Harvard because we were making fun of her for having gone to Harvard. No, here, meaning because you guys were like, I was like, you guys don't fight. But we were making a joke. But otherwise, I couldn't even tell you. I've never looked at them. Couldn't care less. And that tilts people. It's not to take away that you could never work with me. It's just to say that, some things matter and a lot of things don't matter. You should be here for you. And I think in the right organizations, a lot of folks will get a shot. Ma'am.
Hi, Chamath. Thank you for coming in. Before I get to my question, I just want to say you definitely have a lot of heat. The amount of people here at 741, it says a lot about who you are.
Thank you.
And my question is,
As you said that, they all are leaving.
I know, right? What's going on, guys?
That's on you.
Not enough heat yet. So a lot of us sitting here like around at the age like 27, 28, could you help us to paint a picture of how you are like at this age, and what are some of the milestones in your life that from that point on has led
At
to your
27,
success?
28, I had just gotten promoted. I was 26 years old. I was a corporate VP at AOL. I was managing AIM and ICQ. I had been working basically since I was 14 years old. First job was at Burger King. Never really stopped. Even when I was in school, I was going back and forth. Hadn't really partied. Never took vacations. Didn't have many friends. I was just running on a treadmill.
And what are some of the milestones from that point on that led you to who you are?
Honestly, they were not very productive milestones. Getting promoted, my W-2 compensation. I really wanted to have a nice car. I wanted to have a nice watch. I mean, I'm not joking around. I'm just like, I didn't know any better. So I did those things. So I was not a particularly well-rounded person. And I was obsessive, probably unnecessarily so, with trying to get ahead. Yeah, so I think a little bit more balance and slowing down, where if I had a little bit more people around me, that whole go slow to go fast would have helped me a little bit. Yeah, that's where I was. I was grinding. I was in the machine.
Would you have done anything differently now that looking
Not
back?
a thing. Not a thing. Because of now, I can look back on all of it, but I have no regrets. I have learning. I have things that bother me, but that's a different thing. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, that's just like my insecurity talking. But do I regret anything? I mean, there's a couple things, yeah. I love being at Facebook. I loved it. It was a special place. I helped change the world. It was great. It had its downsides for me too, but it was a great place. The time I worked there was magical. Magical. Sir.
Thanks for taking the time. On a similar
Pick it up,
note,
sir. Pick up the mic. Just take it. You can do it.
Thanks for taking the time. On a similar note, are there any habits you practice now that you wish you had started practicing 20 years ago when you were around our age?
I really wish that there is somebody that really looked at my personal behavior and tried to help me see what was going on. I really wish I had the courage to go and see a therapist in my 20s. I don't know what would have happened. And then I wish that I had taken care a little bit more of my body. Basically, like I look like you. For most of my life, until I was in such severe pain, I couldn't even lift my shoulder, arm above my shoulder. I'm not saying you're in pain. I'm just saying I did not take care of. I tried to, I was just always trying to like manufacture this perfect image of myself, and it didn't do it for me. So I was in a lot of pain. I wish I would have taken care of my body a little bit better.
Thanks.
I think we'll probably have to call it there, but thank you so much, Chamath.
You want to just do the last question? Okay, just give this guy last question, and there were no more questions.
Chamath, thank you for being here. Big fan of the pod. I think one of the key reasons it works is because of your friendship. You obviously talk about interesting and, thought-provoking stuff, but I feel the banter, you guys pulling each other's leg and just shooting the shit really like makes the pod what it is. So I'm curious like how your relationship has evolved over time and like, what's the sort of tail risk of you guys breaking up? Because, you've had your roller coasters, you're up and down. So I'm curious how you think about that.
Me and Sachs are the same. Me and JCal are the same. JCal and Sachs are the same. The most volatile combination is JCal and Freeberg because they're not great friends, meaning at the time. And they're learning to be friends. But the other three of us, we've been in all kinds of shit together. Professional, business. And so, ours is a brotherhood and David's the newest brother. And so I think it's really more about Jason and Freeberg finding a good energy. But I think it's going to be great. I really appreciate you guys inviting me. Good luck to all of you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. This is awesome.